It's been a while since I personally talked about DreamWorks on here, where today calls for something different yet again. Because if you know me, then you would know I am first and foremost a Disney fan and a Disney critic, focusing on their year of their 100th anniversary that has turned out for the worse. But in that same period too, DreamWorks has been making very wild moves, ones that you could call inconsistent at best, with their recent releases at the tail end of last year with Puss in Boots, and the box office failures like Ruby Gillman that I honestly forgot existed till this very point, and of course the mixed Trolls 3, a franchise I do not particularly like at all, but still very popular with younger generations. But for today, is something that actually moves back into familiar territory that I admire in of course the Kung Fu Panda franchise with the movie of Kung Fu Panda 4, a film that actually quite excites me for the promises of where the story is actually headed. Because if there's one thing that DreamWorks does excel at, it's the fact that they actually make good sequels. Well, at least for most, miles better than what Disney's own studio has produced that I've recently focused on that has worried me, and is only turning them for profit that extends some franchises beyond their own lifetimes, where for the most part in DreamWorks' case, they can at least say they have competent stories added onto it. Some are a little bit iffy like Shrek the Third, but for the most part, and others like Puss in Boots and what we've seen so forth, are actually of good quality, with of course actually having good villains in each of them too that most Disney sequels at this point haven't included at all, which of course to be fair, is only 2 in the modern era with both Ralph and Frozen, but also more to follow as suit as we would later on expect. But focusing on Kung Fu Panda at the moment is a franchise that I admire greatly that actually expands its story and world building to a different level while dealing with the same overall message for each of them that applies to Po's life and the decisions he makes compared to the villains that represents the failures of the past. And with what I have seen so far in a movie that is going to be released very soon at this point, then I can fully say that this will take it to the next level, combining its past, its present, while entering a new future, all through a villain who is a chameleon who can shapeshift into previous foes of the past while also our main hero himself. Which is of course the main thing I'm excited for the most part in this case, with having the cast that this movie is going to present with both actors coming back and those who have actually been signed on presently. Wherein more notably in this regard is the return of favorites like Ian McShane as Tai Lung being brought back from the dead for something more nefarious that the chameleon represents, being played by the wonderful Viola Davis, which of course can only mean the return of Lord Shin and Kai, the former of which I am most excited about returning because of the fact he is one of the greatest DreamWorks villains to ever grace the screen, which the more you think about it and what the chameleon represents, is the right move for this movie to make, considering that other films like Puss in Boots had 3 distinct villains rolled into one, where a new villain who steals the powers from those of the previous generations is something that is very interesting, which of course also ties back into Po's story and how his previous arc was his entire journey to become the Dragon Warrior, but is now something different, as I hear this is actually 4 out of the 6 movies at this point, which actually makes sense like a story arc for Po to actually grow on, becoming a warrior hero in the first one, and then of course becoming a master in the second, like a complete saga in that regard, like our own favorites like Star Wars and so forth. And I also can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm also excited at the prospect of Awkwafina's character in this movie as Po's main sidekick. I mean, I get a little tired at the fact that she's casted in every single animated movie, especially at the Disney ones at this point, with the characters in The Little Mermaid and Raya being annoying as hell, as I hate those ones, and that Illumination movie I'm never going to see in my entire life that is releasing this year that she is also starring in. But as for something like this and DreamWorks, I just found something that fits quite well within this film with what I have seen so far, and cannot wait to see that performance as well as that will entail. Which of course makes sense for where the plot is headed with the characters, where it says Po is actually gearing up to become the spiritual leader of the Valley of Peace, but also needs someone to take his place as Dragon Warrior. As such, he will train a new Kung Fu practitioner for the spot and will encounter a villain called the Chameleon who conjures villains from the past. And if it's able to pull itself off, then it can gladly justify those 2 other movies that are supposedly planned, unlike another studio in that actual regard, as long as those messages can still be applied in new ways and actually have a decent conclusion regardless. Because at this point, DreamWorks is still going to have terrible films like Boss Baby 3 or whatever they did with Trolls that still milk something that doesn't need to exist except for the target audience of babies. That's always going to exist, and there's going to be more of it, which actually worries me for this industry that we're not trying something new or something competent that actually concludes a decent story. Because I think the most promise we can find out of this is the fact that the villains of the previous films are actually returning, and most especially Tai Lung in that regard, which can lead to a variety of potential added with it, with mainly of course the hopes of a redemption arc for his character than what we originally got, and applied to how Po learned on his journey, since he did start with the mistakes he did in his quest for power, and then learning learning what power actually really meant and why Po was the dragon warrior who was able to vanquish all of these foes for something new. Then again, I won't seriously be throwing all of my hope into this film because I learned my own lesson when climbing the ranks of being a YouTuber in the hype when Puss in Boots was first released as the new DreamWorks renaissance, when then yet again they went back to failure in their next movie RWBY, and then again in the other franchise I don't like. But I still know at the very least that they have an ability to design worlds with a decent plan in mind, where even where Kung Fu Panda 3 seemed the much weaker film of the franchise, I still really enjoyed its take to close off that trilogy that moves us within the confines of the next. And then again, how this franchise has taken a popular reception in China, being another plus to why these films are so good for something that is produced here, when most films out there do tend to get mixed results, especially focusing on the fact it deals with China itself. Like how other films like Mulan 2020 failed so badly because they hated what they did to it, but praised films like Kung Fu Panda for its own interpretations to its own culture. But then the last thing that actually excites me about a Kung Fu Panda film is its animation, where things so far seem pretty great so far as the standard that 3D DreamWorks films goes, but also promises something great within those 2D sequences of flashbacks and dreams that the franchise is also known for. My favorite where it blends both styles in 2D and 3D and reminds us how useful it is for storytelling of any type and why I do appreciate these movies the most. But with those elements said, I am confident that Kung Fu Panda 4 will be a decent sequel and probably one of the best animated films of 2024, and excited to see where it goes in the story of Po. And I'm all done. So goodbye.